Hello chessmates! Welcome to another video on our series on beating chess masters with modern defense. One of the basic principles we are taught at the beginning of learning chess is to build a strong pawn formation in the center in order to maintain overall control of the game. On the flip side of the coin, you also need to exploit any possible weakness in the said pawn formation of your opponent. The following on-board tournament game against an old Filipino International Master or IM is one such instance of exploiting weakness in the center's pawn formation. Let us watch the game. D4, G6, approaching modern defense. C4, Bishop G7. This is modern defense, whose trademark is the black's fianchetto bishop at G7, placing it at its longest diagonal. As you may recall, in our previous videos, modern defense is an example of what Aaron Nimzowitsch called hypermodern defense, whose main principle is to let the white pieces initially control the center and for black to challenge this initial control immediately afterward. In modern warfare, this is like allowing the enemy to occupy the battlefield and then challenge its presence by means of aerial bombardment and all-front ambuscade on the ground. Knight c3, d6, contesting white's control over e5 and c5 square, and at the same time opening the bishop at c8. Knight f3, developing the knight. Bishop g4, that is threatening white's knight, which controls the d4 and e5 squares, and thereby indirectly challenging white's control over those central squares. E4. This massive pawn formation, c4, d4, and e4 by white, is known as the Aberbach's variation of the modern defense, which is characterized by central control and potential breakthrough on the queen side, starting with c5 and b4 later in the game. Knight c3, threatening to take white's pawn at d4. d5, pushing the pawn and threatening the knight at c6. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. And then knight d5. Now, after move 7, true to the spirit of modern defense, black has now equal control over the center. White controls the e4 and d5 squares with his pawns, while black controls the e5 and d4 squares via the bishop at g7 and the knight at d4. Moreover, it can be observed that it is black now which has a knight outpost at the d4 central square. Bishop e2. Bishop e3 immediately threatening the black's knight outpost is more popular in practice compared to bishop e2. c5, further protecting the knight at d4 and further control of the center, of course. D takes c6, contesting the control. D takes c6, and then B takes c6, contesting the control over the d5 square, and at the same time keeping the knight at d4. Bishop e3, finally threatening black's central knight. e5, protecting it. h4, threatening to push forward and make a breakthrough in the king side. h5, preventing it. Queen d2, knight e7, finally completing the development of the minor pieces. Bishop takes d4, eliminating the central knight at last. E takes d4, taking the bishop and threatening the knight at c3. Knight d1, and then c5, further supporting the pawn at d4 and preventing possible c5 push by white. f4, white is starting to build its pawn formation again. Rook b8, trying to activate the rook along the semi-open b file, thereby tying white's queen or knight to protect the pawn at b2. Rook g1, threatening f5. Bishop h6, preventing the f5 push and removing the bishop along the semi-open g file, which is now controlled by white's rook. Bishop d3, and then knight c6, that is threatening white's pawn at h4, and if white protects it with rook h1, then black's next move will be queen f6, winning white's pawn at f4. So the international master decided to offer exchange sacrifice in order to avoid pawn loss, either at h4 or f4. Bishop takes g5, winning the exchange. H takes g5, and then h4, pushing the past h pawn. King f1, h3, king g1, h2 check, king h1, then queen d2, that is planning to penetrate into the king side. f3, making room for white's queen to rescue the king. Queen h3, and then queen f2, queen h4, threatening white's pawn at f4 and offering an exchange of queens. Queen takes queen, rook takes h4, maintaining the threat against white's pawn at f4. b3, untying the support by knight at d1. King d7, marching the king forward and at the same time connecting the b rook to the h file to further support the pawn at h2 and take white's pawn at f4. Bishop e2, then rook b to h8, further supporting the pawn at h2 and maintaining the threat to take the pawn at f4. Knight f2, rook takes f4, finally winning white's pawn at f4. King g2, knight e5, rook h1, rook h5, threatening to win another pawn at g5. g3, threatening to take black's rook at f4. But here, white voluntarily steps into a mating net. Perhaps he was expecting that I would move rook f to h4, wherein he could play the devastating move f4, threatening my knight and at the same time my rook at h5 by means of his bishop. So what I did was something perhaps he was not expecting. Rook takes g5, sacrificing the other rook at f4. King takes f4, and then rook g2, threatening the white and bishop and protecting the pawn at h2, and more importantly, threatening g5 checkmate as soon as white's king is prevented from escaping via f5 square. So he played knight d3 and then king d6, preventing white from escaping via f5. Bishop f1 and finally g5 checkmate, checkmating white with pawn. So as shown in this game, we need to remind ourselves of trying not to be terrified if we happen to play with the chess master. What matters in the end is the quality of the move and not the title. In fact, any chess title is a product of the quality of moves a title player, whether a national master, a FIDE master, an international master, or a grandmaster, had consistently made earlier in his or her career. So if you enjoy watching this game, then click the like button. And if you want to watch other games in this series of beating chess masters with modern defense, then just click the subscriber button. See you in the next video, God willing.